there'll be a link posted in the chat throughout this presentation. So you can go check out our past webinars. They happen once a month, and we've had some really interesting topics in the past, just as interesting as what we're going to be seeing today. So before we begin, I would like to do a land acknowledgement. For those who are in different areas, I'd welcome you to put your own land acknowledgement in the chat. So Bishop's University is located on the traditional and unceded territory of the Abenaki people, and we acknowledge that we are settlers on this land, and we will continue to educate ourselves and work towards reparative actions. So I'll leave a few seconds for anyone that would like to put their own land acknowledgements, and for people to reflect a bit about what it means for them to partake in reparative actions in regards to education. So I'm not seeing any other land acknowledgements. I got a bit ahead of myself, and I forgot to mention that this presentation is recorded. And so anyone who would like to leave their cameras on, you are more than welcome. But just so that you're aware, this presentation will be on a public website. So just so everyone knows, we'd also ask you to leave your mics off during the presentation unless you have a question. Then we'd ask you to raise your hand or leave the question in the chat. There'll also be time at the end of the presentation for more questions so that we can have a discussion. But for today, so we have here with us Heidi Haavan Grosh, who will be speaking to us about learning to see using children's literature to rediscover nature. So currently she is an assistant professor at Nord University in Norway. So she has worked with children of all ages over the past 4 decades as a storyteller, teacher, and in many non-traditional settings. She's also a farmer and very engaged in visual literacy. And so I will let her introduce herself a bit more and tell us more about literature.
Thank you. I will share my screen because then I have some pictures to help that process. So everything look okay with my screen sharing? Great.
Yes.
So I am great. So I am, as you said, Emily, a farmer. I live in the heart of Norway in a place called Trøndelag. So if you take the map of Norway and fold it in half, it's right where that crease is. And we are Christmas tree farmers, so we are in the season. And that is that connection to the land and that connection to what the land can give us. We also have wildflower seeds, is part of my inspiration for thinking about how children's literature can help us rediscover nature. I also love working with grades 1 through 7 especially, but have, as you mentioned, worked with all different grade levels. So I'm just going to share my journey, and today we're going to look at 4 different ways of sort of challenging ourselves to think about nature and global warming and climate change in different ways. So I will just, so first I want to ask you a question, because when we think about the color, and you don't need to answer the question, this is a rhetorical question, but when we think about what color the sky is, our response is often the sky is blue. But when we really, really look at the sky, and these are pictures from the same vantage point of the sky at different times of day, different times of year, and the sky isn't just blue. And so that first thing is becoming aware of the world around us, becoming aware of what it is that we see, becoming aware of the changes that are happening all around us all the time. So part 1, becoming aware. So one way of becoming aware is to use our senses. And throughout the presentation today, and you have to stick through the whole presentation before you get the carrot at the end, because I have put all of the references into a Padlet so that you can just click on the Padlet and you have them there, and there will be links there to take you directly to what it is that I'm talking about. So this is the first book. It's called You Can Write a Story by Lisa Bullard. It's set up like a recipe book. So you just follow the recipe for writing different ways, and it gives you some concrete things like this page I have here. When we use our senses, we are in tuned to things in a different way. So here, for example, she's talking about Hawaii. So what can you see in Hawaii? What can you hear in Hawaii? What can you feel in Hawaii? What can you smell in Hawaii? What can you taste in Hawaii? So if you are wanting to get your students or your children or even yourself sort of in tuned, this is a good place to start. To take a place that you might be familiar with, to step outside your door wherever you might be, and to try to describe what it is that you see or taste. You probably can recall that smell of the grass after it's just rained, or for those of you who are from winter climates, what it feels like when it's really cold outside and the air is just crisp and it sort of bites into your skin. Once we can start to really play with our senses that way, we start to become more aware. So here's a poem. It's winter where I am right now. Winter is the king of showmen, turning tree stumps into snowmen and houses into birthday cakes and spreading sugar over lakes. Smooth and clean and frosty white, the world looks good enough to bite. That's the season to be young, catching snowflakes on your tongue. Snow is snowy when it's snowing. I'm sorry it's slushy when it's going. You can see here we're using those senses. Ogden Nash, tree stumps into snowmen. What do they look like? You know, turning physical objects into something else, spreading sugar over lakes, that idea of using metaphor and simile. The world looks good enough to bite. So that sort of vivid sensory language is so active in poetry. And in just a minute, I'm going to give you some ideas on how you can use poetry to sort of tap into that understanding of the world around you. Again, this first part being becoming aware. So another thing that you could do, and we're recording this later, so if you want to stop the slide, stop the video and talk about this with your students, you can certainly do that. But what sorts of texts, and again, thinking of the broad sense of text, a text not just being something that we read, something that we listen to, something that we watch, what other kinds of texts can we find, for example, about snow, or about winter, or about summer? And gathering those things and then looking at them and studying the language in them can also help us become more aware. I think about Frosty the Snowman and walking in a winter wonderland. And then once we've sort of primed the pump of our sensory awareness of the world around us, then we can start talking about, well, but how has the weather changed? How has the climate changed? I know here in Norway, we don't have the snows that we used to. Many parts of the world are experiencing drought or flooding. So using a simple poem, using a simple activity about the world around you can help lead us into a more complicated, a more layered discussion about the climate. So here's another. Many of you have written shape poems before. Shape poems or concrete poems. Shape poems or concrete poems that where you put your words into something in using a word or using sentences to make the shape of that object. So here are a couple of different ideas on how you can take a shape or a concrete poem to a different level. Again, becoming aware of a scene that you find outside. So in the first example, in the lower left corner, you see that I have made a tree and I have described that tree. A tree trunk is tall and many animals could live there. A squirrel, perhaps. Tall grass grows taller in the sun, deep down below the dirt. A worm squiggles. Worm. Worms do not like the sunshine. So you can draw a scene that you see outside, and then you can fill it in, describing it within that shape. The second example is for a younger learner, and it's just using words like flower, 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 petal, petal, petal. And then the third example are different kinds of plants, because one way of being aware is thinking about where our food comes from. And one way that we can do that is to discover the plant. I planted an artichoke plant this year for the first time, and I didn't realize that the artichoke grows at the top of the plant. It was fascinating. So again, using something that's concrete, like I know that I have to eat vegetables every day, but where do they come from? That also helps with that awareness. And throughout this conversation we're having today, awareness brings that connection. And one of the best ways for us to learn about nature and to embrace it is to have that connection to it. So here's some concrete shape poems in a different way. I encourage you to give it a go. Haiku is another way, and again, poetry is a way to help us become aware, and haiku is often focused on the details of nature or everyday life. They're often personal, express a reaction or reflection to what is described. So here's some examples, and then I'm going to give you a recipe. Just like in that writing book that I shared with you earlier, now I'm going to give you a writing recipe or a model text that you can adapt for your own learners. From time to time, the clouds give rest to the moon beholders. Green and speckled legs hop on logs and lily pads, splash in cool water. You can see already the sensory words that are being played within these haikus and the pictures that they're painting with their words. In the evening twilight, only the mushrooms are illuminated. An old silent pond, a frog jumps into the pond, splash! Silence again. So here's your recipe. If you are, again, watching this as a video, then you can stop and you can try this out yourselves. So haiku often is 5 syllables and then 7 and then 5. And a simple format is in your first line, think about the who, the noun. What is the object or thing? So the green tree is tall. Then in the second line, 7 syllables, the what, and that could be your verb or your action. What is that object or thing doing? So the leaves are waving at me. And then in the third line, the 5 syllables, the when or the where. What is the time of day, the season, or what is that thing or the setting? So it is soon summer. And suddenly you follow the recipe, you follow the model text, you have become aware of the world around you, and you have a poem. The green tree is tall, the leaves are waving at me, it is soon summer. Something accessible to learners of many ages. Now, all of this is prepping us for our first picture book. And this is a book called Daniel Finds a Poem by Mika Archer. And if you want to read a more detailed review of the book, again, you can find it in the reference list at the end or in the Padlet that I share with you at the end. There's in the recommended reads of the Cleely Journal, I've written about Daniel Finds a Poem. So Daniel Finds a Poem is all of the images are in collage. And even the illustrations, and if you go to Mika Archer's website, she has a really nice video that talks about how she makes her images. And she was inspired by Ezra Jack Keats. You might know him from The Snowy Day and his work. And collage is a great way, again, of becoming aware of recycling, of thinking about where things come from and how things can be reused, because you can make collage images from anything. So that's a concrete way to help your learners think about the materials that they use and that whole idea of recycling and reusing. So in Daniel Finds a Poem, Daniel is in the park and he's asking all of the creatures that he encounters, what's a poem? One day, Daniel parts the cattails and finds Turtle. Hello, Turtle. I have a question. Do you know what poetry is? I think poetry is sun-warm sand, Turtle says. Again, you've prepped your students by talking about this, using the senses. Maybe you've played with writing a haiku or doing a concrete poem. And then when you meet this text, when you meet these questions in Daniel Finds a Poem, then all of a sudden you're more aware of the sensory images that are there. Sun-warmed sand. That has a much richer visual images than just sand. So those nuances can be very powerful. Poetry, says Frog, is a cool pool to dive into. On the way home, Daniel stops to watch the sunset reflecting in the pond. That looks like poetry to me. To me too, says Dragonfly. That idea of becoming aware of the world around us is in a way bringing poetry to life. When we start to see that piece of grass growing out of the crack in the cement, or an ant crawling along a leaf, or a sky that's not just the color blue, we start to see the poetry of the world around us. We start to become aware. So another example that you could do with your students is to think of an animal or an insect or a bird, a creature that you would find out in nature, and how would that creature describe poetry? How would a snake describe poetry? How would a fly describe poetry? How would an ant describe poetry? And you can think concretely again, what do they do? What do they make? What do they need? What do they see? And then your students write one sentence. And if it's a younger learner, a fly buzzes. Or if it's longer, the fly lands on my jelly sandwich and soaks in that part of my humanness. At the end of the poem, and again, Daniel Finds a Poem is a very small book. I have it here. It's not a very long picture book, but it's full of these wonderful illustrations. And at the end, he takes all of these things that he's learned. Morning dew glistens, crisp leaves crunch, and you can start to hear those sensory words, the onomatopoeia, the use of adjectives, the metaphor simile. There's a home with many windows in the old stone wall, cool pools to dive in, sun-warm sand to lie in, singing at twilight when the day is done, bright stars in the branches, moonlight in the grass, and silent wings to take me wherever I go. So your students have written these sentences about the different creatures. You put them together and suddenly you have your own poem and you've found poetry in the world that surrounds you. You and your students have become aware. If you want to pursue this idea of poetry, here are a couple of great links. The Book Trust has Poetry Prompts Library, and Ken Nesbitt's Poetry for Kids he has lots and lots of resources, but he has a specific area on nature poetry, connecting kids with the environment through verse. So there's your little poetry package about becoming aware. And now we'll move to part 2. But before we do that, One last resource, Ralph Fletcher, his website and blog are great, has, just like I gave you Lisa Bullard's book about writing at the beginning, this is a great one about writing poetry, writing a poem from the inside out. And if you look at the cover, if you can see it, look what he writes at the bottom. Get in the habit of observing the world. Capture a moment. So there you go. I just found out, I don't know if any of you have read this book yet. It just came out and it has come up in conversations many times over the last few weeks. Linda Sue Park, you might be familiar with her as an author, has written this novel, and it's not very long, so it would work for a younger reader. Gracie Under the Waves. Gracie loves to snorkel, and she's in Honduras with her family, and she discovers that the coral reef is in trouble, and she takes action. And it's very empowering to read about a young person seeing something that they feel isn't right and taking action about it. And I'm going to share some more of that with you a little bit later. In an interview with Kansas Public Radio, Linda Sue Park says, wherever we are and no matter where we live, the health of the planet should be on everyone's list. And she uses these words connection, community, and collaboration are what we need to focus on in our stories. Connection to each other, connection to the world around us, community, and collaboration. So those are some things that will come up again and again as we talk about how literature can help us become more aware of the world around us. In this book, she also says, I see you, you are important, you matter enough for literature, you are not alone. So this is a book where our young children or older children or someone we know or even ourselves might see ourselves in this story. Gracie Under the Waves. Check it out. One more thing that you can do then to connect yourself to nature and to try and find its voice and use its voice, and here we're coming back to another poetry format, is to use the I wish format. And again, I've made it very straightforward, so you can follow it as a recipe. You can stop the video if you're watching this later and try it out. So my example is the earth and the climate. And if you want to follow the format, the first I wish is the situation, and you could use the word people. And the second is yourself. And the third is we together. And so if this is the earth or the climate speaking, I wish people thought things through. I wish people were not so egotistical. I wish people could see that they were hurting me. I wish I could be your partner. I wish I could be sustainable and still meet your needs. I wish I could still support all the life forms I used to. But mostly, I wish we could work together. I wish we could treat each other with respect. I wish we could live in harmony. So again, a very straightforward recipe that you can adapt to whatever age group you're working with, because they will use their own voice to tell their own story. And if they put themselves, we often talk about putting ourselves in someone else's shoes to understand the life that they are leading. What if we put ourselves in the shoes of something we find in nature? Put ourselves in the shoes of an ant or a flower or the forest or the sky. Okay, so that was becoming aware using poetry. Now let's talk a little bit about the trees, because I am a Christmas tree farmer, so we got to get trees in there. And you may have noticed that I have a lot of tree paintings behind me as well. And I also want to bring in the idea of the ecosystem here. Now, eco or echo, depending on where you're from, is short for ecology. And ecology, and here's some words we brought up earlier: building relationships and connections, Remember in Gracie Under the Waves, we had that word, the author was talking about connections and community. Building relationships and connections between organisms and the environment, not harming the latter. And that's really interesting. So let's think about these eco words. Eco means not harmful to the environment. But if you put an H in there, it's that idea of echoing, that repetition, reverberation of sound. You can just think about that for a little bit, because it again brings in that idea of relationship and connection and community, that it's not just about us taking from nature, taking what we want, but it's about us giving back. And that's the way that we work towards a healthy world. Into the forest I go to lose my mind and find my soul, says John Muir. So, how important is a tree? Let's jump into some other ideas. One thing that you could start with your learners is to say how many books or stories or movies or series can you think of where a tree plays an important role in the story? And then brainstorm, brainstorm, brainstorm. And then how many of those trees are in danger? So here are a couple examples I thought of. The Giving Tree, an old story. Some of you may be more familiar with it than others. A tree that gives himself to the boy, and as the boy grows older, the tree gives more and more and more and more and more. Avatar, I'm guessing most of you have seen Avatar, and you have that tree of life that's in danger. I don't know if any of you have read Enid Blyton's The Enchanted Wood. It's a great story where all of these different creatures live in this magical tree, but there are gnomes or trolls at one point digging down in the roots, and the whole health of the tree is affected, and it affects everything living in that tree. And I'm guessing that many of your learners, and right now, probably you have some ideas spinning around in your head already of books or stories or movies or series that have to do with trees and how important they are or how they might be in danger. Let me share a couple with you. The Lorax. It's also interesting to think about using a film and a book version of something. And the Lorax, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, the trees get cut down. The Lorax is not happy about that. So that's a good thing that you could use to start talking about deforestation and what our responsibility is. You may have heard or may not have heard of the picture book Tidy by Emily Gravett. A very industrious badger wants to clean up the forest, and he ends up cleaning up everything. He takes out all the rocks, and he takes out all the trees, and he completely cleans out the forest. And reading a book like this also can open up conversations to that idea of balance, that idea of give and take. We can't take away everything. So he came back and started putting the trees and the rocks back. So it's an interesting story about perspective. It's a lot of fun. Another book that I have just discovered is a book by Karina Lakin. And in the Padlet, I actually share a version of a video of her reading her story. It came out in 2021. It's called The Tree in Me. And I'm going to show you a couple of pictures from the book, and notice that none of the trees, none of the images, the tree is green. And just like we started at the beginning, what color is the sky? When you ask what color is a tree, it can be many things. It starts out, the tree in me is strong. It bends and has roots that go deep. And because there is a tree and a sky and a sun in me, I can see there is also a tree in you. So that idea of trees being a living, breathing essence. This would be an interesting book for you to share with young learners on a very simple level, but even with older learners as you are thinking about who we are and what life means and how we're connected. Another picture book that is really interesting that talks about deforestation and that connection and that community between animals and trees and people is called Where's the Elephant? And it's written and illustrated by Barreau from 2016. You see, it's like a Where's Waldo kind of hunt and peck book. So there's an elephant and there's a parrot and there's a snake. And at the beginning of the book, there's lots and lots and lots of trees, and you have to try and find them in these trees. But then as you go through the book, the trees are cut down, more and more houses are built, and it's really easy to find the animals until they're just standing by one tree. Very interesting, simple story, but again, a very good way to start discussion about that idea of the importance of trees. And if you were wanting to create your own version, every child could make a tree. As you see, all the trees are different, just like all of us are different, but we still make up one forest. If you want something a little more factual, Peter Wolleben has this book called Can You Hear the Trees Talking? Discovering the Hidden Life of the Forest. Because you know, trees connect under the ground and their roots connect signals. Again, that would make a good connection back to the film Avatar. Some of the things that come from his website discussing this book: how do trees talk to each other? Through the wood wide web. Get it? Why are trees important in the city? How do trees make us healthy and strong? How do trees get sick, and how can we help them get better? I'm linking you as well to a book called Global Warming, The Complete Briefing by John Houghton. And he cites that the total area covered by forests in the world is almost 1/3 of the world's land area, of which 95% is natural forest and 5% is planted forest. But the net loss in forest during the 1990s, he says, was about 2.4% of the total forest area. And deforestation of tropical forests, which is, they make up about 47% of the forests worldwide, is about 1% a year. So you can talk about trees, you can use a picture book, you can go into some of the fascinating things about how trees communicate, and then you can send your students off to do a little research to find out what's actually happening in the world today. Number 3, animals. We've talked about becoming aware. We've talked about the ecosystem and trees and how they are connected. But what about the animals and species and habitat? So here's a couple of books. The Last Bear, which came out in 2022 by Hannah Gold. A young girl, April, goes with her father to a weather station north of Svalbard, which is in the Norwegian, just north of Norway. And she sees a polar bear in trouble, and she helps him out and befriends him and ends up saving his life and helping him get to safety. Now, it's fiction because, you know, we don't recommend that you go and befriend a polar bear. But the author says, at the time of writing, most of the children's books that featured climate change were set in a dystopian future, but I deliberately chose to set The Last Bear in the current day. And she wanted it to be less about fear and more about hope. If you want to combine, sometimes combining a fictional text with a factual text, here's a really straightforward factual book, Polar Bear, Why is Your World Melting? Let's dive into these a little bit more. First, if you look at the map on the right, you can see where it says there's a plus and it says North Pole. And if you go a little south of that, you can see Svalbard, and that's the area about where this book takes place. And if you look at the image on the right, you can see how from 1879 to 2012, the ice cap is melting at a very rapid rate. So this is an actual effect of climate change, and polar bears are sort of the poster child for climate change. So I'm going to just read you just a little passage from The Last Bear. April knew that some ice caps formed in winter and then melted in summer and looked a bit like interlinked jigsaw puzzles floating on the water. Again, we're painting pictures with our words. She also knew that once upon a time there were way more ice caps than there were now, but what she didn't know was how this affected Bear Island. The ice caps used to extend this far south, Dad explained. Which meant that the bears could reach the island in winter? Exactly, he replied. Polar bears are mostly marine animals and they use the ice caps as a hunting ground to catch seals. But now the ice caps are melting, it means they can't travel as far as they used to. That's why the polar bear population is dropping. But if the ice caps around her are melting, melted, Dad corrected. Melted? April amended. If the ice caps around her have melted, does that mean a bear can never get back to Bear Island? So here you're using a novel to talk about climate change and melting ice caps in the Arctic through the voice of a young girl. That ticks a lot of boxes, doesn't it? So what can the Last Bear teach us about? It can teach us about climate change. It can teach us about biodiversity. It can teach us about endangered animals. There's only about 22,000 polar bears left in the world. The World Wildlife Foundation ranks endangered, vulnerable, and threatened animals sort of in a list of what's most at risk. And it's a great website with lots of good information. Again, it's linked in the Padlet at the end. And the author, Hannah Gold, talks about why the polar bear is sort of the poster child. There's something incredibly special about a polar bear. So it comes as no surprise that they are often called the poster child of climate change, because as the Arctic warms at double the rate than the rest of the planet, they are sadly bearing the biggest brunt. Even more sadly, according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, it is predicted that the polar bear population will be in serious decline by 2050. So there's some good facts and some good reflection at the end of this novel as well. The Last Bear also talks about plastic pollution, and that's something that's very prevalent in many people's minds. We hear about, like you see the image of the turtle with the plastic getting caught on them, or animals getting caught in fishing nets or plastic bins. This is how April meets the bear. His front left paw had something tightly wrapped around it, a blue plastic of some kind. He brought the paw up to his mouth and gnawed at it with long, sharp teeth, growling under his breath as he tried to bite it off. But it was no use. The paw had swollen to twice its size, and the plastic had wound its way impossibly tight. There was no way it was coming off. His head remained hanging low, and he looked so vulnerable, pathetic even, that April's first instinct was to run across and give him a big squeezy hug, even though she knew how dangerous this would be. So you can start to talk about a very real situation, a very real problem. You can talk again about recycling through the words of a character in a story. She also talks about all of the things that wash up along the beach. She often did litter picking on the beaches near Granny Apple's house. So out of force of habit, April scoured the beach for anything that didn't belong there. And by the end, she had accumulated 26 plastic bottles for various soft drinks, 7 rusting cans, a black comb, a pink unicorn toothbrush, a large pile of blue netting presumably used for fishing, a random toy car, and 1 half-full whiskey bottle, all brought to the island by capricious currents of the sea from people far, far away. What if you were to read this passage? Maybe your students could find pictures of the things she describes, and then think about how far things can travel through the currents. In a good article by Massey and Bradford called Children as Eco-Citizens, Eco-Criticism and Environmental Texts, I've also linked you to that. Some points that they make that when we respond to environmental issues and attempt to enlist readers in taking action, like April, encouraging them to reflect on the world as it is and to imagine future scenarios if environmental degradation proceeds unabated. And again, Hannah Gold says she wants this book to be about hope. We talked about eco-criticism. Again, I want you to think back on that idea of echo with and without the H, and that idea of communication, and that it really is a two-way process, and that children advocating for endangered species, which is why maybe talking about polar bears can be appealing and accessible for your children, appeals to the emotions as they are often portrayed as attractive and potentially suffering, putting young readers in the position of being a potential friend savior. So to learn more about nature, you have to spend time with it. And I encourage all of you to go outside and actually look at the world around you and to see, again, jumping back to that first part of being aware. So what does it mean? Part number 4, it's you and me, it's us. And in that wish poem, remember that third part was we. People, me, we together. Richard Louv writes in his book, The Last Child in the Woods, that children are suffering from a nature deficit disorder, that sort of lack of connect to the world around them. And so some of the things that I've talked about with you today can help reconnect us. If we jump back to Daniel Finds a Poem and The Last Bear, in The Lost Bear, April reminds us that we need to listen to animals, to observe them, to be with them, to connect with them. Again, if we take no other words with us, it's that idea of connection and community. It's not a trick, but a matter of understanding and seeing them for who they are. It's about listening to them here. And what if we think about doing that with the animals around that? How might it affect our relationships with each other? Daniel listens to the animals he finds in the park. To me, poetry is when the morning dew glistens, says the spider. So that idea, painting pictures with our words and listening with our eyes, that's also an interesting concept. And that also ties in with that idea that we want our English language learners to develop both critical and creative thinking. To know. Cambridge says to know is to inform, but also to become aware, to become familiar with or have experience of understanding of or to recognize, to see. Back to Massey and Bradford, what affects one affects all, that we need to understand that interconnectivity and interdependence we have with nature. Again, collaboration, cooperation, awareness. Future generations will experience the destruction of wild habitats, and we need dynamic, self-motivated people like all of you out there and all of your students to reflect on their relationships with the environment. And again, relationships is the key word, and to take responsibility for our actions. So, as April inspires action, you can learn about real problems by looking at the geography of the world around you. You can talk about extinction. You can think about my own habits and how I could change my world. You could study websites like the World Wildlife Foundation. You could make a collage with recycled images. You could look at the sky. Maybe you record what the sky looks like, or what a particular tree looks like, or what it looks like out your window every day for 6 months or once a week for 6 months. And then you talk about what's changing. And then we also talked about how we could use poetry to give us an inroads into becoming aware. Hannah Gold says in her author's notes at the end, and I just want to read that passage for you as we're wrapping up here. She says, if, like me, you've fallen in love with bear, then the best way to help polar bears or anything else and protect our beautiful planet is to do everything you can to fight climate change. And this perhaps can be our mantra. With a loud enough roar, I know we, not I, not me, not you, but we can make a difference. This is a book that just came out in 2023. It is a graphic novel that explores the journeys and the biographies of 16 young climate activists from Canada, from Indonesia, from Tanzania, from Sweden, India, Pakistan, Australia, Russia, China, Uganda, Ireland, drawn by 16 different artists, drawn to change the world. A visual story of young people making a difference. So here's the Padlet. You can scan it with your phone. You can click on the address, and it has all of the references that I have talked about today. And I've also got the reference lists at the end of the different things I referred to. So remember, be the change. Be in touch, and we need to just keep this conversation going. Thank you. And I'll stop delling so that we can start this conversation. We can start this way of connecting, making relationships. Yeah. Anybody have anything they want to ask or say or comment on, or any other texts or books that you've discovered?
I would just jump in. Oh, sorry. Lippa, you want to say something?
I just wanted to really quickly, unfortunately, I'm a little bit double booked today, but thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. I really, the poetry part really spoke to me. And I just went to Speak, which is our English second language teachers professional conference, and Mimi Masson and Geneviève Brisson gave a really interesting presentation on translanguaging and poetry. So I wondered if you'd had any thoughts about how to integrate multiple languages into this sort of approach to sort of the climate and learning of languages.
Well, actually, yes, because I have been working with an international semester with international students from many different countries, and they have done presentations where they've been working on fairy tales and myths, and when with the myths, they were creating videos and they had to create their own story, like why is the sky blue, why is the grass green, why do birds chirp, but then they used all of their different languages, and again communicating with each in their story through body language and through interactions. And it was really interesting because that's what myths are. Myths are about how do we explain the things we don't understand in the world before science. Story came before science. And so for them to come up with their own stories about a question that they came up with and then make it as an interactive video, that was really powerful. So that was translanguaging, in that they communicated in whatever language they had. And they filmed outside. And it worked really, really well. So yeah.
That's great. Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And again, my apologies. I will have to duck out now, but thank you so much.
You're welcome. Happy teaching. Yeah. Other thoughts?
Michelle, and then Monica.
I just wanted to say I really, really enjoyed it. I love the subject. I love the idea of getting kids back outside. And I can only see some sad children after I read them some of these books. Because I know my daughter's very sensitive, and every time we read about the polar bears, etc., with, obviously like the book that you shared, is that she's very sad after. So this is what I'm imagining in my elementary school classroom, is some sad children. And of course they can make a difference, but we have to teach them how.
Absolutely. And one way to maybe turn it around is to go outside and see how many insects they can find. Like, can you find any ladybugs? Because ladybugs eat the lice that are on the plants. Or do you see any, when after it rains, can you go out and are there any worms outside? And maybe you could just take the worm off the cement and put it back in the grass. And just so simple things, and birds too. What kind of birds do you see? Let's put out some bird feeders. And let's do a little experiment, and let's try what happens if we put out bread and we put out bird seed. Hi. And we put out something else, and then we can watch and see what the birds like to eat. Do they like to eat the same things we do? So that, I think that you can spin it around, and so many times we have these big, huge ideas, but we can do it so simply. I found a spider in the house, and instead of squishing it, I put it outside.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Monica.
Sorry, got my mic activated. Yes, I just wanted to thank Heidi so much for her presentation and for reading to us. I love being read to, and it doesn't happen nearly enough. You're a wonderful, wonderful reader. Thank you. I just, for some of the listeners, during the presentation, we have a website in Quebec, Constellations, which is sort of a repository that helps us choose literature for our classrooms, and also they're kind of organized by level for our ESL specialists. So I was madly checking many of the books you were recommending to us, and they're there. So that's also helpful for us. There are some resources available. So those of us that are teaching in Quebec, many of those we can augment Heidi's wonderful ideas with resources from there as well. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And I just see that there was a request for the link to the Padlet. So I will just do that right now for you and put it in the chat.
I see Ajuro's hand is up. Yeah, okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for this presentation. I really enjoy the poetry part because I'm a big fan of it, even in an ESL classroom. What really struck me the most was when you mentioned the nature deficit children. It really struck a chord because it's very true, and I see it in my school. Even though we're a school in the suburb, the kids really have a disconnection. Yes. Can you hear?
Yes, we
I'm
can
back.
hear you.
I'm sorry. The buttons for Zoom and the buttons for Teams are in different places.
Well,
I pushed
that's
the wrong
okay.
button.
It just it opened my eyes to this disease, because really it is a disease. Because I compare to my first batch of students when I first started teaching, like almost 30 years ago, and today's kids, and you really see what they lack as connection. So thank you for bringing it. Thank you for making us aware of that, because it's going to really enlighten the way I look at these kids and how I can somehow bring them outside again, not just on a cement playground that they have in schoolyard. Look at it differently, because they really are disconnected. Yeah. So thank you for that that point.
You're welcome. And remember, nature is also up. So no matter where we live, we can always look up and see the sky. because that is something that connects us no matter where we are in the world, and that is something that's ever changing. Thank you.
Bianca?
I just wanted to thank you about the poems that illustrated, like I think it was the artichoke. Was that it?
The concrete poems?
Yeah, the concrete poems, because now I see such a strong possibility of doing cross-curricular collaborations between like an English class and a science class. And I had never thought of that before because science is very like structured and it doesn't leave a lot of room for creativity. And so I think that including that and doing collaboration between the science class and the English class would really make children more aware and make it more interesting too for them to learn about this stuff and maybe learn it in a more profound way. So I thought that was really interesting.
Good, good. And it is that idea of, we can spatter English into everything that we're doing. And that last book I shared on the tree section is really that would be a good connection to science as well, because just the way that trees communicate, and you can put in those facts, and when you're reading it in English, then that's an automatic connection to English. Good. And do try planting an artichoke and see what happens. I also didn't know the first time I planted cauliflower that it's sort of buried under the leaves, and I had to Google, where's the cauliflower? And I had to sort of dig around to kind of find it in the plant. So that sort of process of discovery is kind of exciting too.
Can I, if people don't have questions, then I would like to jump in and ask a question. This is so fantastic. I love listening to you and your passion about, bringing children back to nature and, that kind of connection that we should have with people around us and animals and all the living beings around us. I think this is so important. And again, I agree that nature deficit disorder, which is so important these days, I think. I think we're all dealing with this deficit. If you were teaching this, how would you, like, how long would you plan your lessons? Like, would you do everything that you have shown us, or like how would you plan so that the other thing is I'm just wondering, I'm sure the children will be very interested, like right as you proceed with the lessons and the different books, but would you do it for the whole year or half a year? How would you plan it?
Well, that's a very interesting question. In Norway, it's very common in a primary school that children go on an uteskole, an outdoor day, once a week. That's not uncommon at all. I think that everybody has to adapt it to their own needs. What I was trying to give you today was like a potpourri of possibilities. And I think that idea of being spontaneous, we as teachers often have plans on how we should do things, but also being willing to take advantage. Suddenly it's a beautiful sunny day and it's been raining for 3 weeks. Let's go outside and see what's happening. And bringing in that idea of cross curricular activities. But you also mentioned reading aloud. We can read aloud books. We can use books like the Daniel finds a poem as a model to go out and then in science find out more about different animals and creatures. We could, maybe we want to adopt a animal and raise some money to help keep them in the local zoo, or to help keep them alive, or make a cause of it. So I think there's not a simple answer on how long you would do it. I think it has to be what we're passionate about and what we as teachers, again, what we know about our students and what we see that their needs are. But I think reading aloud, that's something that you can integrate throughout the whole year if you wanted to.
Definitely. Thank you so much. Does
Welcome.
anyone have a burning question that you want to ask before we close this? Comments or questions?
Again, feel free to keep in touch. My email's really easy because it's my name, Heidi H. Grosh at nord.no. .no for Norway. So always happy to keep the conversation going.
Yes, then thank you so much. Yes, we really enjoyed your presentation, and thank you for sharing all the resources.
You're very welcome. Thank you so much for all you're doing. And now open the door and go outside.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everyone. I hope you can go to sleep.
Yeah, I can. And I'm sorry I cut out for just a moment in the questions that I dropped out. And then
I noticed that. So yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I pushed the wrong button because, yeah.
It's
Anyway.
very common. Yeah. we do it all the time. You know,
Yeah.
when people share the screen, they also press the wrong button also.
Yeah.
Because it's just next to it. Yes.
It is. But thank you so much for inviting me. And I hope this is what you were looking for.
Oh, this is so great. I'm actually thinking that I will use it in my class and then ask the students to, in Quebec, we call it, it's not a unit plan, but a learning evaluation, LES, learning and evaluation situation. So maybe I'll ask them to try bring some of the ideas together and then create a like an LES. Yeah, I find that we don't. It depends on the school actually. I don't see teachers taking children outside that much. I mean, they would go to the playground but not necessarily to just be in nature and do some like that kind of experiential learning and sensing.
And again, it is intimidating for teachers because they think I'm in a city or I don't have this space, but just becoming aware of what is out there. There are always, no matter where you are, there are insects. No matter where you are, there is grass growing out of crazy places or dust that lands in places it shouldn't be. And those asking those questions about how did that get there is also a start.
Yeah, it's been great. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Enjoy the rest of your day and keep in touch. Thanks for asking.
We will.
Okay.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.